with the debate. Hopefully a book will come out of it. We'll see. We may get up there. If Holger doesn't keep his word concerning refraining from charging, the debate may not come off. If I may get up there, if he has decided to put a charge on the internet, then I'll be headed back home. And I want him to know that up front, and I want brethren to know why that would be the case. I think that'd be dishonest on his part. And someone would stoop to that, but it doesn't surprise me who's the one that did it or was trying to. Anyway, again, it's a pleasure to be with you and to have part in this program. We love and appreciate the good brethren here, the eldership, and Brother Michael and Sister Karen, just sweet, sweet people. They love the Lord, they love the Lord's church, and they pay a dear price on a regular basis for upholding what is right. They and the members of this congregation and the leadership down through the years has paid a dear price. But you know, regardless of what price we have to pay here, the beauty of heaven is well worth it. Amen. The subject of the Sabbath is one of great interest to many people, especially those misguidedly holding the present-day Sabbath day observance. And it is of great significance relative to the study of biblical typology. It is indeed a type of something that ought to be of great importance to every person, especially to members of the precious body of Jesus Christ. And so this evening, let's turn our attention to a brief study of the Sabbath, focusing primarily on its function in the Scriptures and in Hebrew life as a type. Its role in divine revelation is both stunning and sublime. At the outset, we need to first consider the institution of Sabbath observance. The institution of the Sabbath is seen in Exodus chapter 16 in connection initially with the provision of manna by God in the wilderness of Sin for the children of Israel. The people were instructed to gather their manna for each of the first 6 days in the week. On the sixth day, they were to gather a double portion, that extra portion to be used for the seventh day. Whereas when they had attempted to gather more on the other days, the manna began decomposing and became infested with maggots on the next morning, God preserved the extra portion for use on the Sabbath, on the seventh day, which was the Sabbath. Thus Moses said to the people, "This is what the Lord has said. Tomorrow is a Sabbath rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. Bake what you will bake today, and boil what you will boil, and lay up for yourselves all that remains to be kept until morning." So they laid it up till morning as Moses commanded, and it did not stink, nor were there any worms in it. Then Moses said, "Eat that today, for today is a Sabbath to the Lord. Today you will not find it in the field. 6 days you shall gather it, but on the seventh day, the Sabbath, there will be none." That's Exodus 16, 23 through 26. Some of the people, nonetheless, went out to get more, and of course they found none, just as Moses had said, in the field on the Sabbath. It was repeated to the people that they were to rest on the Sabbath day, and so finally they did rest. That's verses 27 through 30. Now, what was the purpose of that Sabbath observance? Later, the Sabbath observance was encapsulated in the law of Moses itself as part of the Ten Commandments, the Decalogue. Israel was charged to remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy, Exodus 20 and verse 8. Moses explained the reason for this entailment. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, But the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall do no work, you, nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your male servant, nor your female servant, nor your cattle, nor your stranger who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that in them is, and rested the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. Exodus 20, verses 9 through 11. It should be noted that the word translated rest and the word Sabbath in our English versions are cognates, coming from the same Hebrew root, as the Sabbath was indeed to be a day of rest. Thus the Sabbath was given to Israel on this occasion as a day of rest as part of their law, to be kept perpetually, to commemorate the seventh day of the creation week, on which day the Lord had rested after completion of his 6-day creative work. Now think about that aspect of things. This directly relates to Genesis chapter 2, verses 1 through 3, and we'll look at that in just a moment. And as an aside here, we need to remember that that text deals with the original creation, that is, the creative work of God in creating the universe. And it covers also the time frame of Genesis chapters 1 right on down through chapter 2. We have some, and now with this AD 70 crowd, they're actually saying that has nothing to do with the physical creation whatsoever. They're saying that Genesis chapters 1 and 2 have nothing to do with the creation of heaven and earth, but with the creation of Israel. That's what they're saying. They say it's apocalyptic language that deals with the creation of Israel. I told them the only apocalypse that had occurred in that regard, I told some of them, was in their brain. Clearly, Moses is speaking in Exodus 20 of the physical creation, of the creation of the literal heavens and earth, and thus of the universe, and of God's resting from having done so, having done that creative work. And if that's the case in Exodus 20, then it also must be the case in Genesis chapters 1 and 2. Some of those fellows have gone as far as some of them have become full-blown theistic evolutionists. Some of them have said that Genesis chapters 1 through 12 even are purely fictional. They're mythological in nature. And that Adam and Eve were not even the original pair, the first human pair. And I can't get Holger Neubauer or Steve Baisden to state where they stand on any of that. They will not come out in the open and state where they are. And yet, they claim to be as conservative as they always have been. Hogwash. Well, what about the limitation of Sabbath observance? It should be observed that there is no evidence that God bound Sabbath observance on any other nation or group of people than the ancient Israelites. The most commonly appealed to text to try to prove from the Scriptures the universality of Sabbath observance in ancient times is, of course, Genesis 2, 1 through 3, wherein Moses noted that God blessed and sanctified the Sabbath due to his resting on the seventh day. If Genesis were written prior to the events of Exodus 16 and 20, the statement could easily be a prolepsis, a genuine prolepsis, with Moses simply reporting in the Genesis account what actually would occur at Mount Sinai not long after the writing of Genesis. The greater likelihood, however, is that Genesis was written concurrently or even after the events in Exodus 16 and 20, possibly during the wilderness wanderings. so that the statement merely records in Genesis as an aside the fact of what had already occurred in these key events. At any event, there is nothing in Genesis 2, 1 through 3, that demands the idea of a universal obligation for Sabbath observance in the Genesis account. Just doesn't follow. While Jesus observed the Sabbath because he lived under the law of Moses as a Jew, he did not bind its observance upon the church any more than he did the obligations of every Jewish male to present himself 3 times at the temple in Jerusalem before the Lord each year upon Christians. You know, the law called upon every male to appear 3 times before the Lord. Those who observe or who claim to observe the law of Moses today, they don't observe that part. They don't practice that one bit. I haven't seen any of them that I've ever dealt with make those pilgrimages to Jerusalem to appear in a temple that doesn't even exist anymore. Imagine the silliness of that. You've got to go over and appear 3 times before the Lord at the temple. Well, what temple? It's not there. It's been gone since AD 70. And so that doesn't follow. If one is going to bind one part of the law of Moses, he's obligated clearly to keep it all, according to James 2, verse 10. This would also include the manner in which the Sabbath would have to be observed, even relative to advanced food preparation, travel, acts of worship, and so on. Take, for instance, some years ago when we were working at the Eagle Lake congregation, Eagle Lake, Florida, where Terry's parents were members. Very fine couple, Clay and Merle Hightower. Just she was a gem. His father was a corker. And some pleasant times. He always treated us royally. Every time we went by to see him, even after she passed, he was a very kind soul to us. And at any event, at that particular time, we had a family by the name of the Ulysses who were members attending the congregation at Eagle Lake. They lived in Winter Haven. Their next door neighbor was a preacher for the Seventh-day Adventist Church. He did not, he observed the Sabbath, or claimed to, but guess what? They did not prepare their food on Friday so they could eat it on Saturday. They went out on Saturday and let the heathens do it. They let somebody at a restaurant, and so we kind of chided him about that if he's going to bind Sabbath observance, he ought to at least be consistent and start preparing his food on Friday, and instead of going out and eating at Bob Evans or one of the other restaurants. Also, while Jewish Christians were permitted to observe the Sabbath in some limited ways for a time in order to win their countrymen to Christ, yet were not bound by the law of Moses as the rule and standard of life. 1 Corinthians 9, verse 19 through 23, I believe, addresses that matter. Romans 7, 1 through 4. We have some brethren that say that they were still bound by the law of Moses, but the problem there is that you would have them bound by 2 laws. You would imply that they were obligated to keep the law of Moses and the law of Christ at the same time, and yet certain aspects of each mutually exclusive. And so how do you account for that? The AD 70 people have a real problem along that line. The early church's primary day of worship was the first day of the week. Acts 20, verse 7, 1 Corinthians 16, 1 and 2, which was also known as the Lord's Day in Revelation chapter 1, verse 10. That phrase, the Lord's Day, is peculiar in the New Testament. The Greek word that is translated Lord's there, or of the Lord, is kuriakos. It's from kuriakos, which appears only one other time in the sacred scriptures, and that with special reference to the Lord's Supper, 1 Corinthians 11, verse 20. 1 Corinthians 11:20, which, as noted from Acts 27, was always observed on the first day of the week. R.H. Charles went into great detail in his commentary on the book of Revelation and in other works to point out that by the 2nd and 3rd century A.D., the phrase the Lord's Day was synonymous across the board with our Sunday, the first day of the week, or the phrase the Lord's Day was synonymous with it. And it makes sense. It makes perfect sense. On what day would be most fitting for us to observe the royal feast than on the royal day? And vice versa. In patristic literature, reflecting the early practice of the church, the phrase was a synonym for Sunday. Well, what about the matter of typology? We've laid the groundwork. Let's look at the typology. Some have falsely concluded that the Sabbath observance was a type of a Sabbath observance for the Christian dispensation, while others who hold to the false doctrine of premillennialism have affirmed that the Jewish Sabbath typified Sabbath observance, which is supposed to occur in a literal material 1,000-year reign of Christ on earth. These individuals claim that at some point in the future there will be a rebuilding of the physical material temple of Jerusalem. Of course, to do that, they're going to have to destroy the Dome of the Rock, and that will lead to a massive war like Israel, the current Israel's not experienced at all. If they think the 67 war or the 73 war or the 48 war was big, destroy the Dome of the Rock and see what happens. You'll have every Muslim up in arms. At any event, the claim is there's going to be a rebuilding of the physical temple, and then Sabbath observance, the whole law is going to be restored, and Jesus is going to reign from the city of Jerusalem upon the physical material throne of David. Concerning that particular doctrine, keep in mind, it just isn't so. It's a false assumption to start with. It's false doctrine. I like Brother Foy Wallace's description of premillennialism. He said pre meant before, millennium meant 1,000 years, and ism means there ain't no such thing. And that is simply the case. It doesn't follow. Jesus Christ is already reigning. He is already the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Revelation 17, verse 14. He has his kingdom now, and those who are Christians are in his kingdom. They've been translated into that kingdom, the kingdom of patience of Jesus Christ, according to Revelation 1, verse 9, Colossians 1, 12 and 13, the kingdom of God's dear Son. As to the other, there's simply no text that affirms either of these views as well. The antitype is always greater than the type. In each of these views, the type and the antitype are the exact same. The type and the antitype are the exact same. They're saying that the Sabbath of the Old Testament typifies a Christian Sabbath. That's just not right. That would be those would be equal, not the antitype being greater than the type. The same would also be true relative to the so-called the premillennial view. The type and the antitype in each is simply Sabbath day observance, and that runs contrary to the very nature of what typology is involved, what it's all about. The antitype is always superior in some fashion to the type. The first view also suffers from the fact the early church simply did not observe the Sabbath as their day of worship, as we've already noted. The latter view fails on the falsity of premillennialism. The Jewish Sabbath actually is a type of the heavenly rest awaiting the righteous at the end of time. Because of their rebellion at Kadesh Barnea, called the day of provocation in the King James, or the day of rebellion in the New King James, the generation that had come out of the land of Egypt under Moses was doomed to wander in the wilderness for some 40 years and was not permitted into the land of promise. This is dealt with in Hebrews 3, verses 7 through 19, and which is based upon Numbers chapter 14, verses 1 through 38. You'll recall that when they came to Kadesh Barnea, on the cusp of entering into the promised land, Moses sent out 12 spies, one from each of the main tribes. And of those spies, 10 came back with a faithless, unbelieving report. 2, Caleb and Joshua, came back with a report of faith. In certain respects, their report was the same. Each of them talked about how great the land was and how massive things were. They were obviously impressed with what they saw. But of the 10, they took God out of the picture. The land swalloweth up the inhabitants, and there are the giants in the land. The Anakim are there. And so they concluded, we can't do it. Bill Klein used to refer to them as the negative committee. They heard from the negative committee, or the nattering nabobs of negativity, as Ronald Reagan would have described them. They did not believe that Israel could conquer the land, even though they admitted it was a land flowing with milk and honey. Joshua and Caleb knew that they could. And the total difference, the whole difference, was in the fact that they kept God in the plan. They saw God. And the basic lesson of Numbers 14 is that God makes the majority. If God is on our side, or better, if we are on God's side, we'll be victorious. The story is told about Dwight D. Eisenhower just before the D-Day invasion, that one of his subordinates came up to him as they were watching the various ships depart and all the efforts being made, planes going overhead, headed toward the continental Europe. And his aide said, I hope God is with us. And Eisenhower reportedly said, I'm not as concerned as to whether God is with us as to whether we are with God. Because if we are with God in this, we'll win. And of course, that's how it happened. I believe in God's providence, and I believe that His providence is what kept us all from speaking German right now, and from goose-stepping as well. But the Jewish Sabbath is a type of that heavenly rest, because it itself was a rest, was intended to remind the people of a rest. Among the men numbered to go to war, only Joshua and Caleb were allowed to enter because of their faithfulness to God. But the Hebrews writer, by inspiration, focuses upon the larger picture, the rebellion of the people of God. God had promised them rest in Canaan, but due to their disobedience, they were not allowed to enter into that rest. And he uses the word katapausen to emphasize it. Hebrews 3, verses 7 through 11, quotes God's words by the prophet David from Psalm 95, verses 7 through 11, which closes with the solemn declaration of Jehovah, So I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest. Hebrews 3, verse 11. In some special way, the Israelites typified God's people under the New Testament. This included their deliverance from bondage, their journey through the wilderness, and ultimately their intended arrival into a place of rest. All the way through, God, by means of these events, observances, and practices associated with the Hebrew people to the very border of Canaan land, testified beforehand by type and shadow of the journey for those who would be made by his people in the New Testament dispensation in this veil of soul making. From the Passover in Egypt, through the baptism of Israel in the cloud and in the sea by the Red Sea crossing, down to Sinai, the giving of the law of Moses, the institution of the priestly system, the construction and nature of the tabernacle, the following of the rock, the smiting of the rock, and every other event leading up to the southern border at Kadesh Barnea, God pointed to another journey that the whole world would have an opportunity to make in order to reach an ultimate rest. The exhortations of Hebrews are given to Christians in particular to remain faithful to God, to be obedient in order to enter that rest. Beware, brethren, lest there be in any of you an evil heart of unbelief in departing from the living God, but exhort one another daily, stressing continual exhortation, regular practice of exhortation, while it is called today, lest any of you be hardened through the deceitfulness of sin. For we have become partakers of Christ, if we hold the beginning of our confidence steadfast to the end. While it is said, today, if you will hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as in the rebellion. Back at Kadesh Barnea, that event. For who, having heard, rebelled? Indeed, was it not all who came out of Egypt, led by Moses? Now with whom was he angry 40 years? Was it not with those who sinned, whose corpses fell in the wilderness? And to whom did he swear that they would not enter his rest, but to those who did not obey? Underline that. So we see that they could not enter in because of unbelief. That's Hebrews 3, 12 through 19. It's instructive to note that the Hebrews writer equates unbelief with disobedience. When one disobeys God, he is guilty of unbelief. It is patently absurd to hold that one can properly believe in Christ without believing what Christ says and obeying what he says. Jesus himself pointed that out. Remember Luke 6:46? Why call ye me Lord, Lord, and doeth not the things that I say? The Hebrews writer would go on in Hebrews chapter 5, verses 8 and 9, to affirm, though he were a son, yet learned he obedience by the things which he suffered. And being made perfect, he became the author of eternal salvation unto all them that what? Obey him. The same basic thoughts found in Revelation 22, verse 14, concerning entering into heaven itself. In order to go to heaven, we have to be people that keep his word, that obey him. Blessed are they who keep his word, that they may have right to the tree of life and may enter in through the gates into the city. You've got to obey God. There's just no other way. Trust and obey. That's required. Over and again, the Bible stresses the importance of obeying. The chapter break that we have between chapter 3 and 4 of the book of Hebrews is somewhat unfortunate, inasmuch as the thought introduced in chapter 3 carries and continues on into chapter 4 to its conclusion. Oftentimes, chapter breaks were just made by the convenience of the translator. Sometimes they were made out of habit. by virtue of the way in which scriptures were quoted or cited or things of that nature, and those breaks were kept that way because early on in the process of making translation, particularly in the English translations, such chapter breaks had become convenient for the memorization of text. In fact, as Brother Nichols pointed out one time, how else do we know about, we refer to such things as Acts 2:38, 39. We have a chapter division, we have versification that breaks the passages down in such a way that it enables us to memorize passages more easily than if we tried to memorize them the exact way they're written in the New Testament, that is, in the Greek New Testament. Because you have no chapter breaks in the Greek New Testament. Simply not there. Be awfully hard to find Acts 2:38, 39 and refer to it in a way that people could reference it. At any event, the text goes on to read, "Therefore, since a promise remains of entering his rest, let us fear lest any of you seem to have come short of it. For unto us was the gospel preached to us as well as to them." Well, it was preached in promise to them. "But the word which they heard did not profit them, not being mixed with faith in those who heard it." And we're talking about an obedient faith. "For we who have believed do enter that rest, as he has said, So I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest, although the works were finished from the foundation of the world." Hebrews 4, verses 1 through 3. The argument is relatively simple. As it is the case that God promised for someone or someones to enter into his rest, katapausin again, and as they fail to enter into it due to disobedience, then the rest remains open, even as the verb translated remains, or it abides open, represents. However, its occupancy is contingent upon faith, particularly faithfulness. The original auditors of the promise failed to enter because their hearing of the word was not mixed with faith. Faith that took God at his word and did what God said do simply because God said do it. Though they heard the gospel or the good news in a promissory sense, the ancient Hebrews in the wilderness let the blessing slip from their grasp. Their disobedience, their lack of proper faith in God, robbed themselves. They robbed themselves of this inheritance. God knew that would happen. Keep in mind that we're dealing with a being who knows absolutely everything knowable at any given point in time from our reference point. He knew in eternity what would happen. And he knew that they would choose of their own free will to disobey. Brother Tom Warren one time was asked about the matter of free will and God's foreknowledge. Well, when you're dealing with God's foreknowledge, you're simply dealing with God's knowledge, period, his omniscience. The word foreknowledge really is an accommodation of how we view things. It's from our perspective. But God is viewing it from his perspective. He knows everything absolutely. Everything knowable, God knows. That's proposition number one. Proposition number two is man has free will. And it is genuine free will that man has. The individual who asked Brother Warren this question one time in debate went on to fuss at him about it and said those things are mutually incompatible. And Brother Warren simply turned it on him and said, "Show that they are incompatible." They are not incompatible. Of course, he couldn't do that. The fact that God has all knowledge and yet he knows what we will freely choose to do are not incompatible thoughts. And simply because someone has a problem with their view of that doesn't mean God has a problem with it. Also, even though the works of God in this respect had been completed since the foundation of the world, that is, since the time of the completion of creation, they failed. It was available to them, but they did not receive it because of their stubborn unbelief. That the time of the completion by God of the works of creation is completed is seen in the following statement. For he has spoken in a certain place of the seventh day in this way. And God rested on the seventh day from all his works. And again in this place, they shall not enter my rest. Hebrews 4 and 5. As God had completed his work in creation and now rested, so they had the opportunity to rest with him, but forfeited it. And they did so through their disobedience or unbelief. But their failure is a blessing to the rest of the world. Their disobedience turns to our opportunity. Their failure leaves the way clear for others to enter who will freely choose to do so, and thus receive the promised blessing. God's word will not fail. He has promised that someone will enter that rest. And he has worked out a wonderful, marvelous plan through the gospel of Jesus Christ to see that that very effect is brought to pass. The promise will be realized. And it is at the heart of all of the other promises that God has made down through the ages concerning the hope of heaven. The argument is thus completed in Hebrews 4:6 through 10. Here's the completion. Since therefore it remains that some must enter in, and those to whom it was first preached did not enter because of disobedience, again he designates a certain day, saying in David, today, after such a long time as it has been said, today, if you will hear his voice, he's talking about obedience, do not harden your hearts. Listen to him, obey him. For if Joshua, the King James says Jesus, referring to Joshua, he also was a type of Christ. If Joshua had given them rest, then he would not afterward have spoken of another day. There remains therefore a rest for the people of God, for he who has entered his rest has himself also ceased from his works, as God did from his. The Hebrews writer under Joshua did not receive their rest, or the Hebrews under Joshua did not receive their rest because of their disobedience. It was not a failure on Joshua's part, but on theirs. Because of that failure, the rest remains available to us. In short, the Sabbath day typified that rest, mutely but efficiently pointed to it. It is not Sabbath observance in the Christian dispensation that it pointed to, as it is the case that the Christian dispensation already existed when the Hebrews writer penned these words. Hebrews 1, verses 1 and 2. And this rest was still being looked forward to here as something to be received in the future. The book of Hebrews goes on to stress that heaven is the focus and place of the Christian's rest. Not this earth, not this mortal coil. We're looking for heaven. It is there that we have the better and enduring substance. Hebrews 10, verse 34. It is there that we have that continuing city, because here we have none. We're looking for that which is to come. Hebrews 13, verse 14. Rest indeed is promised for the faithful child of God. Jesus Christ himself, the rest provider, has said, come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you what? I'll give you rest. In Revelation chapter 14, verse 13, the Holy Spirit declares, blessed are they that die in the Lord, yea, saith the Spirit, henceforth, yea, saith the Spirit, that they may rest from their labors, and their works do follow them. That is the rest that I'm striving for. And that is the rest I hope that you're also looking forward to and laboring each day of your life to obtain. Thank you.
What a wonderful joy that we have as Christians to look forward to something, to have that hope. Later on in that Hebrews letter, in chapter 6, he talks about that by two impossible things in which it was, or two immutable things in which it was impossible for God to lie, that we might have strong consolation, who have fled for refuge to lay hold on the hope that is set before us, which hope we have as an anchor of the soul, sure and steadfast. We have a great anchor for the soul. That's the hope that we have. It's sad that some people would take away that hope. And yet, that's what the AD 70 doctrine does.
Amen.
They have no hope because there's nothing in the Bible past AD 70, according to them. No hope. What a sad, miserable doctrine it is.